The Devil Among Us. Chapter 1. The Path of Jonathan Crawford. New York City in the early 1980s was a city of contrasts, where luxury and poverty coexisted side by side. Jonathan Crawford was born in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, where life was full of hardships from the start. His parents, deeply dependent on alcohol, were far from ideal. His mother, exhausted by endless difficulties and humiliations, sought solace in the bottle, while his father often vented his anger on the family. From an early age, Jonathan knew what pain and fear were. His father, often drunk, would beat him for the slightest reason or none at all. His mother, in a constant state of apathy, could not protect him. Jonathan often hid in a small corner of his room, trying to stay unnoticed to avoid his father's next outburst of rage. Jonathan's school years were also full of suffering. He became withdrawn and unsociable, making him an easy target for bullying by his peers. Teachers often noticed his strange behavior and bruises but never took serious measures, thinking it was just part of growing up in a dysfunctional family. Despite all the difficulties, Jonathan had a sharp mind and a thirst for knowledge. He excelled in school, finding solace in studying and books. Reading became his refuge from harsh reality. In books, he found heroes who overcame their fears and defeated evil, giving him hope for a better future. In his teenage years, Jonathan began to think about his future. He understood that to escape this vicious circle, he had to make the utmost effort. One day, after a particularly brutal beating by his father, Jonathan made a firm decision to change his life. He vowed to himself that he would never become like his parents. After graduating from school with honors, Jonathan enrolled in the police academy. He saw it not only as a way to protect himself and others, but also as an opportunity to control his surroundings. At the academy, Jonathan proved himself to be a disciplined and determined cadet. He trained twice as hard, studied laws and procedures, striving to be the best in his class. His achievements did not go unnoticed. Instructors admired his diligence and ability to grasp material quickly. Jonathan was ready for any task and always strived for perfection. He passed his final exams with top marks and was soon accepted into the New York Police Department. Starting his career as a patrol officer, Jonathan quickly rose through the ranks. His persistence and attentiveness helped solve complex cases. Colleagues respected him for his professionalism and dedication to his work. He never showed weakness and always kept his distance, creating an aura of mystery around him. Soon, Jonathan was promoted to detective. Working in the investigations department allowed him to use his skills to the fullest. He immersed himself in every case, leaving no detail unnoticed. His analytical mind and ability to see what others missed made him one of the best detectives in the city. Thus, Jonathan Crawford, having endured a difficult childhood and the hardships of youth, found his calling in law enforcement. His path to becoming a police officer was full of trials, but each one strengthened and made him more resilient. He became a man who commanded respect and trust, leaving behind secrets that no one could unravel. Chapter 2. Detective Alex Connors. Alex Connors was a native New Yorker and knew from a young age that his calling was to serve the law. Born into a family of police officers, he was familiar with stories of crime and justice from early childhood. His father, Dan Connors, was a respected officer who dedicated his life to fighting crime. Alex always admired his father and dreamed of following in his footsteps. As a child, Alex often accompanied his father on patrols, listening to his stories about various cases and operations. These stories imprinted on his mind and became the motivation for his future career choice. His father taught him that being a police officer was not just a job but a duty and a calling. In school, Alex excelled both academically and athletically, participating in various sports teams, which helped him develop discipline and team spirit. However, his main goal always remained a career in law enforcement. After graduating from high school, he enrolled in the police academy, where he quickly became one of the top cadets. At the academy, Alex stood out for his determination and perseverance. He worked hard, studied laws and procedures, and trained with double effort. His achievements caught the attention of the instructors, who saw great potential in him. Alex passed his final exams with distinction and was soon accepted into the New York Police Department. Starting his career patrolling the streets, Alex quickly established himself as a reliable and professional officer. He proved himself in the most challenging situations, saving lives and solving crimes. His intuition and ability to make quick decisions made him an indispensable member of the force. After a few years, Alex was promoted to detective. Working in the investigations department was a real challenge for him. He immersed himself in every case, analyzing every detail and not missing a single clue. His colleagues respected him for his dedication and ability to solve even the most intricate cases. On the personal front, Alex was also happy. He married his high school sweetheart, and they had a daughter whom they loved more than anything in the world. Alex was devoted to his family and tried to spend as much time with them as possible, despite his demanding job. However, his happy life soon faced a test. Mysterious murders began occurring in the city, shaking the entire police force. Alex took on the case, understanding that he was up against a smart and dangerous criminal. He worked day and night, striving to find the killer and prevent further tragedies. Alex knew that every minute counted. He studied every clue, reviewed surveillance footage, and interviewed witnesses. But the criminal was cunning and smart, leaving no traces behind. This case became a personal challenge for Alex, one he could not afford to lose. The investigation took all his strength, but Alex did not give up. He knew it was his duty to protect the city's residents and find the killer who was spreading fear and horror. His wife supported him, understanding how important this work was to him. Their daughter remained his source of inspiration and motivation. Alex Connors was ready to go to the end, not stopping before anything. He knew that sooner or later, the criminal would make a mistake, and he would be there to catch him. Thus began his hunt for the maniac hiding in the shadows of New York City. Chapter 3. The Beginning of Crimes. New York City was settling into its evening hustle. Jonathan Crawford sat at the bar of his favorite establishment, observing the patrons. His cold, calculating gaze scanned faces, studying every movement and emotion. To those around him, he was just another cop relaxing after a hard day. But deep in his mind, a plan was already forming. Jonathan noticed a young woman, who had clearly had too much to drink, wobbling unsteadily towards the exit. Her unsteady steps and lost look signaled to him that she was the perfect victim. He finished his drink, left money on the counter, and followed her, maintaining a safe distance. Outside, it was dark, with neon lights reflecting in puddles from a recent rain. The woman turned onto less busy streets, trying to shorten her way home. Jonathan knew these alleys like the back of his hand. He had patrolled this area many times. This was his territory, and he felt like the master here. He quickened his pace when the woman turned into a narrow alley. There were no people around, and the silence of the night only heightened the tension. Jonathan got closer, his breathing calm and measured. He felt a surge of adrenaline and cold satisfaction from the forthcoming act. As he followed her, Jonathan remembered his deal with the demon. This encounter happened in his teenage years, after another brutal beating by his father, when he hid in a dark alley. Then a demon appeared before him, offering a deal. Jonathan would fulfill his desires in exchange for freedom from suffering and the power to take revenge and control his destiny. Jonathan agreed, and since then, his life had changed. The demon became his inner voice, guiding and supporting him in his darkest schemes. Now, following his victim, Jonathan heard the demon's quiet whisper, encouraging and directing him. Memories of the deal gave him confidence and cold calmness. When he caught up with her, the woman turned, and fear flashed in her eyes. But before she could scream, Jonathan struck the first blow with a knife. The blade silently entered her side, and she screamed, but her voice quickly faded. Jonathan continued to strike, methodically and mercilessly. Blood flowed down his hands, but he paid no attention. It was important to him to finish the job. The woman fell to the ground, her eyes dimmed, life leaving her body. Jonathan stood over her, watching her final moments. At that moment, he felt on top of the world. It seemed to him that he was gaining control over his destiny by fulfilling the demon's will, which helped him find this dark satisfaction. Finishing his work, Jonathan carefully wiped the knife and hid it in his pocket. He examined the crime scene, making sure he left no traces that could reveal him. Then, unhurriedly, he left the alley, heading back to the bar. He needed to return to normal life so that no one would suspect him of this heinous deed. The next morning, the city was shaken by the news of the found body. Police and journalists flocked to the crime scene, trying to understand what had happened. Jonathan was among them, playing the role of a concerned colleague who genuinely sympathized with the victim. No one could suspect that the killer was right in front of them. This act of violence marked the beginning of a series of brutal murders that soon shook all of New York. Jonathan Crawford, skillfully hiding his dark nature, continued his sinister work, remaining unnoticed. His cat-and-mouse game was just beginning, and he was ready for the next move. Chapter 4. The second victim. Several days had passed since the body of the first victim was found. Jonathan Crawford continued to live his double life, meticulously concealing his sinister intentions. He kept track of the news, relishing the attention his actions brought to the city. Meanwhile, the demon whispered to him about a new victim, and Jonathan knew his next move had to be just as flawless. A young college student, frightened and bruised, came to the police station to report an assault by her ex-boyfriend. Jonathan, engaged in routine work, noticed her immediately. Her frail figure, bruises on her face, and trembling voice awakened the same dark resolve in him that he felt with his first victim. Jonathan eavesdropped on her conversation with the desk officer, his eyes following her every move. She described how her ex-boyfriend had beaten her, how she feared for her life, and how she needed protection. The officer took her statement, promising to investigate, but Jonathan knew the police would not be able to protect her from him. He followed her as she left the station. She walked slowly, fearing every sound and movement around her. Jonathan knew this fear was something he could exploit. He didn't rush, giving her time to reach her home. Night fell over the city, and the streets emptied as she turned into an alley near her house. At that moment, Jonathan quickened his steps, his breathing calm and measured. The demon's whisper echoed in his mind, encouraging and guiding him. He knew the demon was pleased with his actions, and that he had to continue fulfilling its will. When he caught up with her, the girl turned, and terror flashed in her eyes. But before she could scream, Jonathan grabbed her by the throat and knocked her to the ground. He struck the first blow with his knife, aiming for her side. Her body jerked, and a scream escaped her lips, but Jonathan continued to stab, methodically and mercilessly. Each blow brought him a sense of satisfaction and release from his inner demons. Blood flowed down his hands, and he felt her life slipping away. He stood over her, watching her final moments. At that moment, he felt powerful and in control of his destiny. He was the executor of the demon's will, and it gave him strength and confidence. When it was over, Jonathan carefully wiped the knife and hid it in his pocket. He examined the crime scene, making sure he left no traces that could betray him. Then he slowly left, blending into the night's shadows. He needed to return to his normal life so that no one would suspect him of this heinous act. The next morning, news of the second murder spread across the city. Police and journalists once again flocked to the crime scene, trying to understand what was happening. Jonathan was among them, playing the role of a concerned colleague who genuinely sympathized with the victim. No one could suspect that the killer was right in front of them. This series of murders soon became a nightmare for New York. Jonathan Crawford, continuing to hide his dark nature, carried on with his sinister deeds, remaining unnoticed. His cat-and-mouse game with the police and the city's residents had only just begun, and he was ready for the next move. Chapter 5. The detective digs deeper. Several weeks had passed since the city was shaken by a series of brutal murders. New York was in a state of alarm, and the police were working around the clock, trying to find any clue that could help solve these crimes. Detective Alex Connors was at the center of this investigation, tirelessly searching for the maniac. Alex was known for his intuition and ability to see what others missed. He reviewed all materials related to the murders, trying to find a connection between the victims. Every morning began with a cup of strong coffee and a stack of reports that he methodically studied in his office. The first murder, a young woman found in an alley. The second, a college student, beaten by her ex-boyfriend and killed near her home. Alex understood that the murders were meticulously planned and executed with cold precision. The killer left no traces, indicating his high level of preparation and caution. Alex reviewed surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the victim's behavior patterns. He searched for any detail that could point to the perpetrator. But time was passing, and there were fewer clues. The killer clearly knew how to remain hidden and avoid detection. One of Alex's theories was that the perpetrator might be connected to the victims through some common thread. He asked his colleagues to conduct additional checks on possible connections between the victims, but none of the standard avenues yielded useful results. One day, while reviewing footage from a surveillance camera, Alex noticed something strange. On one of the recordings from the night of the second murder, he saw a dark figure following the college student. The figure was barely visible, and the video quality was poor, but Alex felt that this could be a lead. He enlarged the image and watched it over and over, trying to catch any detail that could help identify the figure. The camera captured only a vague silhouette, but something in the movement seemed familiar. It could have been a coincidence, but Alex knew that in investigations, coincidences were rare. He reached out to specialists in video surveillance to enhance the quality of the recording. While they worked on the video, Alex decided to more thoroughly examine every detail of the victims' lives. He started with their social media, phone calls, and social circles. He needed to understand what connected these girls, if anything at all. Alex decided to visit the college where the second victim studied. He spoke with her friends and teachers, trying to understand what might have attracted the killer's attention to her. He learned that the girl was an active student, involved in various activities and clubs. Nothing suspicious at first glance, but Alex did not give up. He also focused on the first case, where the girl was found near a bar. The bar was known for its noisy parties and large number of patrons. Alex decided this place was also worth investigating. He visited the bar, talked to the staff and regulars. Nothing suspicious at first glance, but Alex began to notice some coincidences again. The bartender remembered that on the night of the first murder, there was a regular customer who always sat quietly, not drawing attention to himself. His description matched what Alex saw on the surveillance footage. He began to suspect that this might be the same person who hunted his victims in different places. Alex started digging deeper. He checked all records of bar patrons, studying each one who could match the description. It was a laborious process, but Alex knew the killer would not stop until he was caught. Meanwhile, Jonathan Crawford continued his usual work, unaware that his colleague was closing in on the truth. His overconfidence could become his biggest mistake. Alex felt he was on the right track, and this gave him the strength to continue. Gradually, the investigation began to yield its first leads. Alex found several people who could provide more information about the suspicious bar patron. They described him as a quiet, reserved person who rarely engaged in conversations and always kept his distance. Alex felt that the puzzle was starting to come together. He approached his superiors to get access to more detailed information about all the police officers who might frequent this bar. It was a difficult decision, as suspecting a colleague could cause resentment, but Alex knew he could not miss any opportunity. When he began studying the data, a picture emerged that he did not expect to see. Jonathan Crawford, a respected detective, often visited this bar. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. Could this be the very person he had been looking for? Deep down, he knew he had to keep digging. Alex gathered all the evidence and facts he could find and started building a case. Jonathan was smart, an experienced cop who knew how to cover his tracks. But every criminal, no matter how smart, leaves traces behind. Alex knew it would only take one wrong move to catch him. His investigation deepened, and now he had a goal: to expose Jonathan Crawford and put an end to his murderous spree. Alex was ready to go to the end, not knowing what horrors lay ahead, but understanding that he had to stop this evil before it was too late. Chapter 6. Double Murder. Several weeks had passed since the second victim was found dead. New York continued to live in fear, and the police were doing everything possible to catch the maniac. Jonathan Crawford, continuing to play the role of a model detective, was not stopping. The demon inside him demanded new victims, and Jonathan knew that it would soon be time to act again. The third and fourth victims were two sisters, Lisa and Maria, who were looking for a place to rent. One evening, they were walking through the neighborhood where Jonathan's house was located and accidentally knocked on his door, hoping to get information about rental apartments. Jonathan opened the door and, seeing them, immediately realized that this was his chance. He invited them inside under the pretext that he had information that could help them. The sisters, unsuspecting, entered the house. Jonathan acted quickly and decisively. He knew he couldn't let them leave, leaving behind any traces. The house was silent, broken only by the sounds of their steps. Jonathan offered them to sit in the living room and went to the kitchen under the guise of getting water. When he returned, he held a knife in his hand. His expression turned cold and ruthless. Lisa and Maria had no time to understand what was happening before Jonathan attacked them with the knife. He struck Lisa first, aiming for her side. She screamed and tried to escape, but Jonathan was too quick. Each stab brought him a sense of satisfaction and control. Maria tried to protect her sister, but the strength was unequal. Jonathan, driven by the inner demon, didn't stop until both girls were dead. Their bodies lay on the floor, and an eerie silence filled the room. Jonathan felt on top of the world, fulfilling the demon's will, which whispered words of approval to him. When the murders were done, Jonathan carefully wiped the knife and examined the crime scene. He knew he needed to dispose of the bodies to avoid leaving any traces. He loaded the sisters' bodies into his car and drove them to an abandoned part of the city. There, he hid the bodies in an old building, hoping they wouldn't be found immediately. The next morning, the city was shocked by the news of the found bodies. Police and journalists once again gathered at the crime scene, trying to understand what had happened. Jonathan was among them, playing the role of a concerned colleague who genuinely sympathized with the victims. No one could suspect that the killer was right in front of them. Alex Connors, continuing his investigation, was disheartened. The murders continued, and he felt that time was running out. He studied the new clues, trying to find a connection between the victims and the killer. Each new murder added to the tension, but Alex did not give up. He knew the killer was smart and cunning, but he believed that sooner or later, the killer would make a mistake. Alex began analyzing the behavior of suspicious individuals who might be connected to the murders. He remembered the mysterious bar patron and the connection between him and Jonathan Crawford. Alex's suspicions grew stronger. He knew he had to act cautiously to avoid alarming the killer. Alex began to follow Jonathan, analyzing his behavior and actions. He noticed that Jonathan often disappeared for long periods and returned without any apparent reason. Alex began gathering evidence that could confirm his suspicions. He knew that if Jonathan was indeed the killer, he would need enough evidence to make an arrest. Ahead lay a difficult and dangerous task, but Alex was ready to go to the end. Chapter 7. Getting rid of problems. Alex Connors didn't stop his search. He couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that Jonathan Crawford was connected to the murders. His suspicions were turning into firm conviction, and Alex felt he was close to gathering enough evidence to make an arrest. However, Jonathan was smart and cunning, with skills that allowed him to remain unnoticed. Meanwhile, Jonathan Crawford continued living his double life, enjoying the cat-and-mouse game with the police and feeling the demon inside him approving of his every move. But he understood that Alex's investigation was becoming increasingly dangerous for him. Jonathan decided it was time to get rid of the problem once and for all. His next target was Linda Hayes, a talented journalist who had been conducting her own investigation. Her articles about the series of murders had attracted a lot of public attention. Linda was persistent and fearless, and her reports had become a threat to Jonathan. He read her latest article, where she revealed new details and hints about the killer's identity. Linda was getting closer to the truth, and Jonathan knew that if he didn't stop her, his exposure would be only a matter of time. The decision was made. Linda Hayes had to disappear. One evening, when Linda was leaving the newsroom late, Jonathan was already waiting for her. He had carefully prepared, knowing he couldn't afford any mistakes. Linda walked out of the newsroom and headed to her car in the parking lot. The area was quiet, and there was no one around. Jonathan approached her from behind, hidden in the shadows, and before she could react, he grabbed her and quickly delivered the first stab with his knife. Linda tried to scream, but Jonathan was too fast. He continued to stab, methodically and mercilessly, until she stopped struggling. Blood flowed down his hands, but he paid no attention. When it was over, he carefully wiped the knife and hid it. Jonathan examined the crime scene, ensuring he left no traces that could betray him. Then he moved her body into his car and drove out of the city. He knew a place where he could hide the body so it wouldn't be found immediately. The following days were spent in tense anticipation. Jonathan kept a close eye on the news, waiting for the moment when Linda's body would be discovered. Weeks passed, and people continued to wonder where the talented journalist had disappeared. The police and her colleagues organized searches, combing every corner of the city and surrounding areas. Alex Connors was among those actively participating in the search. He found it hard to believe that Linda could simply vanish. He knew her disappearance was connected to the case she was working on, and he suspected the killer was involved. But there were no concrete clues. A month later, Linda Hay's body was found in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. It was a shocking discovery, and the city once again recoiled in horror. Police and journalists gathered at the crime scene, trying to understand what had happened. Jonathan was among them, playing the role of a concerned colleague who genuinely sympathized with the victim. No one could suspect that the killer was right in front of them. Alex Connors was devastated. Her death was a personal blow to him and further fueled his determination to catch the killer. He began analyzing Linda's latest articles, trying to understand what could have led to her murder. Alex knew Linda was close to solving the case, which meant the killer felt threatened. He continued to watch Jonathan, trying not to reveal his suspicions. Meanwhile, Jonathan knew time was against him. He understood that Alex would not stop until he found the killer. Jonathan began planning his next steps to finally eliminate the problem and maintain his freedom. He knew the next move had to be decisive and flawless. Chapter 8. Jonathan's Decision. Jonathan Crawford felt the pressure mounting. Despite his carefully planned actions, Alex Connors' investigation was progressing. Jonathan knew he needed to take decisive measures to eliminate the problem once and for all. The inner demon, which had guided him all these years, whispered to him about new victims and new ways to escape justice. Jonathan knew his next target had to be Alex Connors himself. Eliminating the lead detective on the case could slow down the investigation and buy Jonathan more time to carry out his plans. But Alex was not just any cop. He was smart and cautious, and Jonathan understood that the attack on him had to be meticulously planned. Jonathan began following Alex, studying his daily routine, habits, and routes. He noticed that Alex often stayed late at the station and liked to take evening walks in a nearby park. Jonathan decided that this place would be perfect for the attack. But to further confuse the trail, Jonathan decided to strike first at the person dearest to Alex, his wife. He knew that this would deliver a severe emotional blow to the detective and distract his attention from the investigation. One night, when Alex was at work, Jonathan broke into the Connors' house. His experience and skills allowed him to act silently and quickly. Jonathan knew that Alex's wife, Emily, usually went to bed early, giving him an advantage. He quietly entered the bedroom and, without wasting time, attacked her. Emily didn't even have time to scream before Jonathan delivered a fatal blow with his knife. Blood quickly soaked the sheets, and Jonathan felt the familiar satisfaction. But this time, Jonathan didn't stop there. He knew that killing Alex's wife was only half of his plan. Now he had to deal an even stronger blow: kidnap Alex's daughter. Jonathan knew that little Sarah was sleeping in her room, and this was his next step. He carefully entered her room, making sure not to wake her. Sarah was sleeping soundly, unaware of the impending danger. Jonathan gently lifted her from her bed and carried her to his car. Sarah stirred but did not wake up. Jonathan drove her to an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, where he knew she would not be found immediately. The next morning, Alex Connors returned home to find his wife dead and his daughter missing. His world shattered. The loss of his wife and the disappearance of his daughter were the hardest blows he had ever faced, but he knew he couldn't afford to break down. He needed to find the killer who had taken everything from him. Alex knew that the case had become even more personal, and he was ready to go to any lengths to achieve justice. Meanwhile, Jonathan acted as if nothing had happened. He went to work as usual, performed his duties, and even expressed condolences to Alex. His cold-bloodedness and ability to maintain calm in any situation helped him remain unnoticed. Colleagues couldn't even imagine that behind the mask of sympathy was a ruthless killer. Jonathan continued to monitor the unfolding events, enjoying his game. He knew that Alex would do everything possible to find his daughter, but Jonathan was confident in his impunity. He had carefully hidden Sarah in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, where no one could find her. Jonathan continued to attend work and discuss the case, while Alex desperately searched for clues. Alex began analyzing the latest events, trying to understand who could be behind these horrific crimes. He couldn't ignore the growing feeling that Jonathan Crawford was involved in the murders and the kidnapping. His suspicions turned into firm conviction, and Alex felt he was close to gathering enough evidence to make an arrest. Meanwhile, Jonathan knew that time was against him. He understood that Alex wouldn't stop until he found the killer. Jonathan began planning his next steps to finally eliminate the problem and maintain his freedom. He knew the next move had to be decisive and flawless. Chapter 9. Hunting the Detective. Alex Connors was devastated and filled with despair. The loss of his wife and the kidnapping of his daughter were the hardest trials of his life. But even in this dark time, he knew he couldn't give up. He needed to find his daughter and deal with the killer who had destroyed his life. In Alex's heart burned a fire of determination and revenge. Alex began watching his colleagues more closely, trying to find any hints of involvement in the crimes. His suspicions against Jonathan Crawford were growing stronger. Alex noticed how Jonathan showed excessive interest in the investigation, how he always ended up at the crime scenes, and how skillfully he hid his true emotions. Meanwhile, Jonathan Crawford understood that Alex was beginning to suspect him. He knew that he had little time left and decided to deliver a decisive blow. Killing the detective had to be flawless, but he knew he needed to act quickly and cautiously. Jonathan planned to attack Alex at his most vulnerable moment. Alex worked late, tirelessly trying to find clues that could lead him to his daughter. He left the station and headed home, trying to rest and process the events. He felt growing tension and couldn't shake the thought that Jonathan was involved in everything that was happening. At this time, Jonathan decided that his next attempt to eliminate Alex should be at his home, not the station. He knew Alex was on the edge, and this made him vulnerable. One evening, when Alex returned home, Jonathan was already waiting for him nearby, ready to strike the decisive blow. Alex entered the house, feeling unusual tension. He checked every corner but found nothing suspicious. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him and turned around, but it was too late. Jonathan, emerging from the shadows, attacked him with a knife. Alex, possessing exceptional combat skills, managed to fend off the attack. Jonathan, realizing his plan had failed, tried to escape. Despite his injuries, Alex knew he couldn't let Jonathan get away. His daughter might still be alive, and every second counted. Ignoring the pain, Alex chased after Jonathan, not losing sight of him. They ran through the streets, crossed deserted alleys, and abandoned buildings. The struggle continued in dark and deserted alleys. Alex, driven by despair and the desire to save his daughter, fought with all his might. Jonathan, despite his fury and determination, realized he couldn't win. He tried to hide in one of the abandoned buildings, but Alex didn't let up. Alex, breathing heavily and feeling his strength waning, finally cornered Jonathan in an old abandoned house. He understood that his daughter might be inside and couldn't afford to stop. Jonathan, cornered, attacked Alex with the knife again. A final struggle began. They fought on a narrow, dark staircase, the sounds of knife strikes and fists echoing in the darkness. Alex, driven by despair and the desire to save his daughter, managed to disarm Jonathan. In the decisive moment, he overpowered him and pinned him against the wall. Jonathan, breathing heavily, realized his game was over. Alex, without wasting time, rushed into the basement of the house. In the dim light of his flashlight, he saw signs of a struggle and heard quiet sobs. His heart tightened with horror and hope simultaneously. Alex quickened his pace and found little Sarah at the end of the basement, tied up and terrified. He quickly freed her, hugged her, and assured her that everything would be all right. He called the police and medics to take care of Sarah and arrest Jonathan. That night, Alex saved his daughter and put an end to the nightmare that had gripped New York. But the scars left by this struggle would stay with him forever. Chapter 10. Retribution. The events of that night left an indelible mark on Alex Connor's life. The police arrested Jonathan Crawford, and the city finally breathed a sigh of relief. But for Alex, this was not just a victory. It was the beginning of a new chapter. He knew that ahead lay lengthy court proceedings and attempts to cope with the trauma his family had experienced. Jonathan Crawford stood trial for a series of brutal murders. The trial attracted nationwide attention. The press extensively covered every session, every step taken by the lawyers and prosecutors. Despite all the evidence, Jonathan remained cold and unremorseful, insisting on his innocence. His calmness and confidence gave many the impression that something more than mere human cruelty was behind him. Alex testified as the main prosecution witness. His testimony was clear and convincing as he detailed the circumstances of the arrest and his suspicions leading him to Jonathan. For Alex, this was personal, and he did everything possible to achieve justice. In court, numerous pieces of evidence of Jonathan's guilt were presented. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and forensic results all pointed to him being behind the series of murders. The prosecutors presented a compelling case, leaving no doubt about his guilt. Meanwhile, Alex tried to rebuild his life and that of his daughter. Sarah slowly recovered from the horror she had endured. Alex was there for her, supporting her and helping her cope with the trauma. It was not easy for him, but he knew he had to be strong for Sarah's sake. The trial lasted several months. Jonathan tried to manipulate the court and public opinion, but the truth was on Alex's and the prosecutor's side. In the end, the court found Jonathan Crawford guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Alex, this was a moment of retribution. He knew that justice had prevailed, but he also understood that ahead lay a long path to complete healing. Life would never be the same, but he believed that together with his daughter, they could overcome all difficulties. After the trial, Alex returned to his work, but with a different perspective. He knew he had to fight for truth and justice despite all obstacles. His experience and intuition had become even sharper, and his desire to protect innocent people only grew stronger. Sarah gradually returned to normal life. She found support among friends and loved ones, while Alex tried to be there for her when needed. Together, they overcame the pain and fears, finding the strength to move forward. The story of Jonathan Crawford and Alex Connors became a lesson for the entire city. People understood that evil could hide behind the most unremarkable masks and that the fight for justice required courage and determination. Alex Connors became a symbol of this struggle, and his name was forever etched in New York's history as the name of a man who did not stop in the face of danger and won.